The biggest bias in news media today isn't between the left and the right. It is bad news bias. An overwhelming concentration on stories of death, disaster, and division. This is not just the news media's fault. This is also something that has been driven equally by audiences. My name is Angus Hervey. I'm a political economist and the founder of Fix the News, an independent media company dedicated to sharing stories of progress. It is an alternative source of information that says not everything is terrible, there are good things happening, and most importantly, there are people in the world who care enough to solve these problems at a large scale. I believe that if we want to change the story of the human race in the 21st century, then we have to start changing the stories that we tell ourselves. The most important news story that's happening in the world that nobody's talking about right now is the rollout of the malaria vaccine. It's arguably the greatest public health story of all time. We have just learned that there is a new treatment that is effective in stopping AIDS, and it only has to be taken twice a year. China is now deploying wind and solar so rapidly that carbon emissions there look likely to enter structural decline this year in 2024. Tobacco use is falling dramatically in Africa. We've seen big breakthroughs on diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. In the past 12 months, same-sex marriage has been legalized in Estonia, Greece, most recently in Thailand. That's a country of 70 million people, the first country in Southeast Asia. Child marriage has just been outlawed in Sierra Leone. 12 countries have expanded the rights of women in the last 12 months. The United States, violent crime is down to the same level as it was last in the 1960s, which is a story that doesn't get reported anyway. And globally, murder rates are down in almost every single region in the last decade. Throughout our species history, multiple problems have been thrown up. I remember being at school, in high school, the largest killer of people globally was AIDS. And today, 25 years later, global AIDS deaths have come down by 2/3 since their peak. So within my own lifetime, within half of my lifetime, humanity has overcome one of the largest pandemics we've ever seen. These big problems keep on getting thrown up, but these big problems also keep on getting overcome and solved. Statistically, and on almost every front that we care about, the world is getting better. And yet it's also possible for us to say the world is getting better, the world isn't good enough yet. Our successes in the past should give us confidence moving forward into the future that all of these things that aren't good enough yet can be solved as well, just in the same way that we solved them in previous generations. About a decade ago, I reached a bit of a crisis point in my life. I considered myself to be someone who was very well informed about the world. And increasingly, everything that I was reading, studying, and researching as a political economist told me that we were headed for disaster. And it was really at the low point in that I made a decision. I said, I can either continue in this same vein and descend further into darkness, or I can be someone who tells the story of change and tells the story of progress. And so I made a decision to be an optimist. But I wanted to be an optimist that was informed by actual data. I came across the work of people like Steven Pinker and Hans Rosling, and also started looking at more evidence around bigger long-term trends, and realized that the story that I was hearing in the news media wasn't actually an accurate reflection of what was happening in the world. Across almost every aspect of what we care about for human progress, rising living standards, public health, climate change, the clean energy transition, conservation, human rights victories. There were so many stories of things going in the right direction, and that really was the genesis behind Fix the News. It was an effort to create a news publication that reported on genuine stories of progress. What this work has done over the last 10 years is it's taught me a lot more intellectual humility. I still can't believe that 10 years ago I was so wrong about how the world worked and what was happening in the world. What it's taught me overall is that it's important for me to always retain the possibility that I might be wrong about other things as well. Because what I've come to realize is that being wrong without realizing it feels exactly like being right. There's a really interesting paradox when it comes to climate change. Most people have never felt more despair about where things are going And yet those of us who have been looking at this problem for the longest have never felt more hopeful. 10 years ago, we were on track for a much worse future. And what's happened in the last 10, and particularly in the last 5 years, is that the exponential rise and the exponential deployment in clean energy technologies has happened so rapidly that we look like we're going to start seeing a decline in emissions a lot sooner, and that decline in emissions is going to be a lot steeper than almost anybody predicted, even just a few years ago. And really, the most important country in the world when it comes to climate change is China, because China is by far the largest carbon emitter in the world. Really, climate change isn't actually a global problem. Climate change is primarily a China problem, and then there's a little bit of the United States, Europe, and India thrown in. So they account for something like 60% of global carbon emissions. Clean energy is now the cheapest and most accessible form of new energy, which means that China, the largest carbon emitter in the world, is now turning the corner. And as China turns the corner, and as that becomes more apparent, I think in 2 or 3 years' time, we're going to be telling a very different story about how climate change, the biggest threat of our generation, is now being solved increasingly rapidly by the deployment of renewables. There is a cultural practice in journalism that I think explains a lot of the reason for this overwhelming negativity that we see in modern day news media. And that cultural practice is a desire to seem intelligent by saying negative or cynical things. You sound more intelligent when you're being cynical, when you're being negative. Our default is to pay more attention to things that are dangerous or scary. And so it requires a constant effort over time to actually overcome that particular bias. The great thing about all of this is that the solution is in the hands of us as individual audience members. You, on an individual level, can actually train the algorithm, because so much of news today is algorithmic. And by clicking on certain stories, you can increase the preponderance of those stories in your own feed. You are not a helpless victim in the face of the algorithmic deluge. You are an active agent in bringing different types of information to you. When you change the types of stories that you're consuming, it actually changes you on a physiological level. You have a qualified optimism for the future. You have a different understanding about the world around you, that you feel differently about other human beings. And that allows you to step through the world in a very different way. It is the most powerful idea I've ever come across. Because this idea changed my own life so dramatically, it's something that I would like to bring to a much bigger audience. What I hope to achieve by speaking, by spreading this message to audiences on stage, accompanied by beautiful visual storytelling, is to make an impact that's deeper than just seeing something online, to actually connect with people, to give people hope, to provide that qualified optimism, and to make an impression that lasts long after the event is over.